So, the Pocket Cinema Camera Firmware Update 7.9, is it worth doing? Let's answer that question today. So Blackmagic brought out a new firmware update back in June, and I've been running it on my cameras now for a few weeks, and I thought I'd just give you a little bit of an update as to A, what the differences are, what that firmware update has done, and B, whether it's worth doing or not. There are a number of changes that happened in the 7.9 firmware update. Some of them are fine. If you use them, if they need them, then they're great. But for me, I don't really make use of them, so they don't really make any difference to me. But there is one in particular that I'm really excited about, and I am very happy that they have done. But I'm going to talk you through some of the changes, some of the things I like, some of the things that I don't like, and I'll let you know what this big update is that I'm really excited about. So let's dive in and have a look. So, the firmware update on this camera. There are a few features that this new firmware brings in. So these include, there's a number of updates regarding lens control, and this is the one bit I'm not so bothered about. There are now controls on here for the focus assist and all that kind of stuff. So if you've got those extra add-ons that you can use to control the lenses with, there is now a lot more control in here for that, so that's great. They've also apparently updated the focus, the autofocus on here. I can't say that I've noticed much of a difference on that. For me, the autofocus on these cameras has never been one of its strong points. It's okay, it kind of does the job. For me, it's almost 50-50. You hit the autofocus button, and sometimes it finds it and sometimes it doesn't, and it's just so hit and miss for me on that. I don't use it very often. I certainly don't rely on it. It can be helpful at times. There are times when you can just hit that button, and if it can find the focus and it can grab it, it's not too bad. But I don't feel like that autofocus has made a huge deal of difference. But for me, the autofocus was never a selling point for these cameras anyway, so I'm also not all that bothered by that either. Some other updates are they've also updated the Blackmagic RAW, so there's now a new version of Blackmagic RAW on here, which is also then compatible with other cameras, so there are other cameras now that can record into Blackmagic RAW. Again, doesn't bother me because these cameras have always been able to record Blackmagic RAW, so that, again, I've always used Blackmagic RAW. Blackmagic RAW is a great codec to use. I love working with it, but yeah, the fact that it's now supported on other cameras doesn't bother me because I'm using it on a camera that's always supported it, so that's fine. So that's all the stuff that is there and is fine, but doesn't really bother me either way particularly. Those things I'm not that interested in. The bits that I am interested in, however, there are two updates that I have found very interesting. And the first of those is the overall look. They have updated the whole user interface on these cameras. So what you now see on the camera screen has changed from what was there previously. Now, most of it is very, very similar. There's a lot of things that are very similar. One of the big differences is that a lot of the information is now a bit smaller. They've reduced it down. They've added one or two things on the screen. The screens have always been great, and they've always been very helpful with the information that you can have. And anything on here, you can tap into it, and it will just pull up a menu for that thing. You can then adjust it, and that's always been the case, and that's always been really helpful. But there are now a couple of extra buttons that they've added. So previously, the only information you could get was what was on the screen, and if you needed anything else, you had to go through the button to get into the main menu. Now they've added a button on the screen that you can tap into to get into the main menu. Again, that's a fairly minimal difference. You could still have done that through the physical button before, so it's not huge to add that in, but it's there. The other thing that they've also done is previously you only had two indicators down here to show you whether you had media attached via USB, some kind of SD card on the USB port, and the CFast card, the internal card that you could record out onto. These cameras do also allow for you to record to an SD card. I don't think you can record Blackmagic RAW to an SD card. I think it's only ProRes that you can record out to SD card. I'm not entirely sure. I don't ever use SD cards for recording. The Blackmagic RAW files are big. I will quite easily record a few hundred gigs on a project, and some projects are even into terabytes of storage by the time I've recorded multiple cameras and multiple takes and things. So an SD card doesn't really help me at all, but it is an option. There is an SD card slot in there. You can record to SD card. And now there is an indicator on the screen to show you your SD card and to show you how much storage you have on there. So they've added that in as well. Again, doesn't help me, but it might help you. So that's now there. Now the downside of adding those extra features is that everything now is smaller. So it's more difficult to read all your indicators. The histogram is smaller than it was before. The audio indicator is smaller than it was before. The duration, the indicators down here for how much storage you have on each of your media storage, that's all just smaller. It's more difficult to read, I think. And all of the information on the top is all smaller. Now, there are both pros and cons to this. One of the things that I really love is that there is less clutter getting in the way of the shot. You can see so much more on this screen now of the thing that you're trying to capture. You can see a nice big clean image with minimal distractions, and I really like that. I've actually noticed that has made a big difference. One of the things that's so often tricky when you're filming is to make sure you're paying attention to the very edges of your frame and what is included and not included in the edges of your frame. And on some camera screens that can be quite hard to see because of the extra junk that's around. There's all the information that they display. It can be quite hard to actually see exactly what is happening in that frame. Whereas now that they've reduced all this down, I do think it's made it so much clearer. You can really see very clearly, exactly edge to edge, what is happening within the frame of your shot, which I love. That's great. I can put these two side by side. Here is some footage I took for a previous video of the old firmware update, so you can see how different the two screens look now. Most of the information is pretty similar, as I say. It's got the same things in there. However, as you can see, the information is just a bit smaller on the firmware update on 7.9, so you can just see a bit more of what's going on in the overall image on the camera screen there. The downside, as I've said, everything's smaller and therefore a little bit more difficult to read. Now, the stuff along the top actually is fine. I don't mind that these are slightly smaller, so you can still see quite clearly white balance, ISO, your f-stop, all of that information is all along the top here, and it's still very readable. There's no problems with any of that. The stuff along the bottom, however, I find a lot more difficult. So the duration of your media storage, that's the one thing that I'm struggling with most, is just being able to read how long I've got to record on any of my given media. And really what I end up having to do is it gives you a little bar, and you can read along that bar and you can see it will colour part of the bar in to show you how much of that media is used. And I'm just having to look at that little bar and just see, oh, okay, I've only got about a quarter of that bar filled, so I know there's quite a bit of storage on here. That's pretty much as good as my indication gets on this camera now, which that is a little bit tricky. I generally shoot onto an SSD, an external SSD via USB, and I know on those that I would normally have a decent amount of recording time. The only time that that's going to become problematic for me is when I'm doing a particularly long project. I do from time to time film an entire show, an entire performance that might be, say, 2 hours long. And so I need to make sure that I've got at least 2 hours of time on the drives. So that's when that might become more difficult. I guess the solution is going to be to use an external monitor and make it a bigger screen, and then I'll be able to see that more clearly. I haven't had to deal with that yet, so I guess I'll just cross that bridge when I come to it. But yeah, that's the one thing that I'm struggling with a little bit as it stands at the minute. The other thing that's slightly annoying but not the end of the world is the histogram, and the audio indicators are also a bit smaller and a bit more difficult to read as well. I do rely on the histogram, so being able to see that quite clearly is really helpful for me. And I will also make sure that my cameras are recording internal audio as well, so it's really helpful for me to be able to have that. Now, with the audio indicator, you can tap on it and it actually brings that up for you, and you can see a lot more information about the audio, which again, that's really handy, so you can see your audio indicator there. I would like them to do the same thing for the histogram, really. If you could tap on the histogram and pull up a big histogram, that would also be quite useful. But there are other tools on here. You do have the ability to be able to use false colours and things like that. So there are other ways that we can set exposure and those sorts of things. So it's a slight annoyance, but I think for the added benefit of being able to see the frame more clearly, I'm happy to live with all of that. So those, in my opinion, are the relatively small differences that have happened in this firmware update. But there is one big difference that I am really excited for and I am really looking forward to trying out. And that is that with the update to Blackmagic RAW, they are now including in here something that has always been part of these cameras but has never been utilised very much before. And that is that these cameras have a gyro built into them, so it can measure its position. If you rotate the camera, tilt it, turn it, whatever you do with it, it will know where that position is. What they're doing with the latest Blackmagic RAW is they're including that information into the video file. So that video file, when you record that video file, it will also include gyro positions. Now the big thing with that is that they are also going to do an update to DaVinci Resolve, their video editing software, later in the year, and when that comes out, DaVinci Resolve will be able to take those gyro positions and stabilize your camera footage based off the gyro information included in your video file. And when that comes out, that's going to be a real game changer, because that's going to mean that you're not going to need to have a gimbal with these cameras. You can shoot these cameras handheld, run and gun, move around, and wherever the camera's pointing, it will record that gyro information. And when you come to DaVinci Resolve, you will be able to stabilize that camera footage really quickly, really well, really easily, with very minimal effort. And so far, this is all theoretical. We haven't actually had a chance to use this yet. But when they released the update, they made a little video about it, and they did show some examples of it, and it seemed to work pretty well. That what they were showing on the screen was great. And if it works as successfully as they demonstrated it working, this is going to be a really great update, and I'm really excited and looking forward to being able to use this. I guess I will have to let you know when that happens as to how successful that is and whether it works as well as it looks like it should. But from what I can see so far, it looks pretty exciting, and I'm certainly looking forward to that. I think that's going to be a really great update. So, the question that I asked at the very beginning, and we're going to come back and answer now, was, is it worth doing this firmware update? Well, I would generally say yes, it's always worth doing a firmware update. Firmware updates generally are going to bring you some kind of a benefit, even if it's just making sure that you keep up to date with the latest things, particularly if it's a free firmware update. There's very rarely any harm in doing it. One other feature actually that I've forgotten to mention that is also included is once you've done the 7.9 update, any settings, LUTs, all that kind of stuff that you store into the camera will be saved from update to update. So any future updates from this point on are going to store and save all your settings. Previously that hasn't happened. So I actually use the presets in here to store a preset for this studio space. So I have a preset set for this room. So when I take the cameras out and shoot anywhere else, I can change the settings and not have to worry about it. And then when I come back in here, reload that preset and everything's back to how it should be. Now previously when I've done that, if you then do a firmware update, it just deletes all those presets. Any settings that you've got stored in there just get removed, and that's been really frustrating. So to now have them saved in the firmware update from any future firmware updates, that's going to be really handy. So another little feature there that I quite like. So overall, yes, do the firmware update. There's no harm in it. I certainly can't see any major negatives. There are a number of positives, particularly if you use a lot of the lens control stuff, the zoom and focus, all that sort of settings. Loads of additional features in there for that. And as I say, the whole gyro thing and being able to stabilize your image, for me, absolute game changer. So that's well worth having that ability as well. So overall, I think it's a good firmware update. I think it's well worth doing. I think Blackmagic are really good at doing this. I think so many of the Blackmagic products have done this, where they've brought new features into the product by doing a firmware update. We saw it quite a lot through lockdown when they released the whole A10 mini series, the vision mixers that they brought out, and they brought out loads of firmware updates, and as they did them, they added in more features to the devices when you did the firmware update, and they're now doing the same with the cameras with the whole gyro thing. It's a really big benefit of using Blackmagic gear, I think, that they do just add these extra features in free of charge. You just download it, install it, and off you go. And I love that. I think they're always looking to improve their products even after you've bought it, which I love it. I'm a massive fan of these products for this reason. So yeah, do it. Do the firmware update. You will get some benefits from it depending on how you use your cameras. Some of the benefits may be more useful to you than others. But look out for the DaVinci Resolve update as well, and those whole gyro stabilization things. That's going to be an absolute game changer when that comes out. I'll try and let you know, and I'll probably make a video about it as soon as I see that. But that's it. Do the firmware update, get some benefit from it for now, and when the DaVinci Resolve updates, there's going to be a big update, and that's going to be a brilliant thing to have that gyro stabilization. Really looking forward to that. That's it for now. Hope that's been helpful. If it has, please hit the thumbs up, consider subscribing, hit the bell icon, all those amazing things. Thank you so much, and I'll see you in the next video. Oh, one other little thing. They've also added in frame guides for 2:1, which personally, I'm a big fan of 2:1 video aspect. I think that's a nice little one to add in. So another little added benefit there for you. You can now see what you're shooting if you're shooting 2:1.